So what really is community economic development? Well, Wikipedia tells us that it's a field of study that actively elicits community involvement when working with government and private sectors to build strong communities, industries, and markets. That tells us nothing. That is a whole bunch of political jargon right there that means little to nothing. So we reword that definition and add our own interpretation. We can call it a series of locally implemented policies designed to achieve social and economic improvement for the disadvantaged. But once again, this is just kind of a definition that's a whole bunch of big words trying to sound fancy. It's just boring. It doesn't really mean anything. So we begin with a community where we have a whole bunch of people here. And this is the fundamental of community economic development. Well, why are people here? Well, maybe they don't really have a job. They're unemployed. Additionally, they could be suffering from lack of ownership, just straight up institutional inequality, such as racism and sexism. There could be low wealth in the community. The low wealth results in no resources and no investment potential. And additionally, they don't have access to markets, but because it's just basically a mess. We are here, we have a mess, and we want to get here. That's community economic development. Except it's community, so it's more like this. This leaves one giant question. Straight up, how are we going to do this? Well, wouldn't it be nice if there was a magic formula with a 100% success rate? Do this and your community will be economically developed. Unfortunately, that doesn't really exist. So we began by taking a whole bunch of communities and realizing each one is unique in their case. Therefore, they deserve a unique plan. This makes a whole bunch of sense. Each unique community needs a unique plan. Now, when we take these unique plans, we find that there's a whole bunch of factors, a whole bunch of elements that go into ultimately successfully developing a community. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we could take a whole bunch of common elements from here and put them into a formula? But once again, no formula exists, so we develop more of an algorithm for community economic development that will look something like this. We begin by identifying, well, which community needs to be developed. And, well, this is an easy question, not necessarily, but could be easy. We see things such as racism or lack of education, all the aforementioned things. Additionally, a lack of capital for development. There's no development potential, no investment potential, but I mean, kind of, but not really, because as Hernando de Soto tells us, there's this thing called dead capital, essentially capital where there's no ownership claim, so no one knows what to do with it. Maybe just an empty lot sitting there that you can't really work with because, well, who owns it? So we have a whole bunch of capital that we can't use, and therefore there's no potential to invest. No growth. So we ask ourselves now, well, how did we get here? And thankfully, that's a question we've been asking a lot as of recently. And Saul Alinsky tells us it's mainly a result of exploit and neglect by external institutions who come in seeking basically profit. They look at a community like this and they see, well, how can we make money out of this? So they look at the community and they see, well, it looks exactly like this to them. And this is the system called capitalism. We have external capitalists looking to basically just make money. We have this guy who wants to privatize all the profits. Now, what about the community? Well, what do they get? Well, they socialize the costs. The capitalist is able to privatize profits and socialize costs. So these guys over here on our right, well, they get pollution, and, well, they also have to deal with a lack of resources and using up all the capital and unemployment once the capitalist leaves. And when he does leave, well, then again, there's no capital. There's no more potential for investment. There's a hierarchy, a social hierarchy, because we have the elites who have money and investments and jobs, and then there's everyone else. And additionally, there's no potential for external investment anymore. So he's left as a mess. And additionally, who does a capitalist produce for? See, capitalism gets worse and worse when we really start to think about it. Well, the capitalist sees everyone as a whole bunch of needs, but he's only going to produce for the monetarily backed needs, and this makes a lot of sense. If you're attempting to make a profit, you're only going to produce for where there's money. Consider this guy right here, and this guy wants to have a nice luxury sports car, and then there's all these people who want to have bread. Now, the guy who wants the sports car is a millionaire, and the people who want the bread each have a penny. So who's the capitalist going to produce for? Well, obviously he's going to produce for the car because that guy can afford it and everyone else can't. So there's no money to be made on the other side. Now, this is not all we have to say about capitalism. See, capitalism also produces the issue of ownership. These elite people over here, they have ownership, they have investments, such as companies and stocks that grow their wealth. And everyone else, all the common people, well, they have some shiny consumer goods that just kind of hold their value, maybe lose it over time, and maybe they have a house, but we'll get into that one later. This creates the illusion of equality. Basically, all these guys have income. Everyone has an income. And that income, we can say, is, well, relatively stable. maybe people are kind of on the same level with income, but what about straight up wealth? Well, wealth includes the assets and the investments, and the elites have a lot more than the non-elites, and for that reason we do suffer from extreme wealth inequality, even when income equality may not show up. But this is still the issue of capitalism, a system that produces and fosters poverty. We have people who are stuck without wealth, and so we use community economic development to try to fix that, try to come in and correct the disadvantages of a capitalist system while working within the system, which seems like kind of a contradiction, trying to fix something while you're using it. But ultimately, if we play our cards right here, we will achieve some sort of stability and balance within the community. And this is where we get into our algorithm, and we're going to begin our three-step process for community economic development with assessment, establishing what already exists in the community. Basically, what are we working with? And this begins with defining the community itself. So the community may be defined spatially or in terms of a common interest. Maybe it's defined in terms of a common means of expressing people's opinions, or a mutual issue that everyone shares, or a common voice, or even a common enemy, in this case capitalism, because capitalism is the common enemy of all communities seeking to do community economic development. Next, we define space within the community, and this mainly relates to the space of financial decisions, such as where do people shop or where do people open a business. But more importantly, where is investment coming from, and where do people invest? Where is the capital potential for growth? Where is the source of that? Next, we define resources within the community, which, as we learned in elementary school, includes natural resources and human resources and capital resources. But more importantly, in the scope of community economic development, we look at technology and straight-up investment money. Now, the investment money is what's going to allow us to grow within different communities. It's what's going to allow us to perform physical development. And technology is going to be what governs the relationship and the changing relationship between capital and labor. Next, we look at rules within the community. So within the community, we have markets and interactions and common spaces, common things that the community owns. But there are rules that govern all of these things. Rules that govern ownership according to what the community thinks is fair and just. So the rules set forth priorities within the community, common values and aggregate preferences, but also goals that the community is seeking to enforce. So through rules, we're able to establish a set of community values that we will seek to pursue in the actual process of development. Next, we look at institutions, and institutions are any place where we have interaction or a governing body, and the governing bodies in specific are going to be in charge of production and interactions and connections within the community, how the community stays in touch with each other. Institutions are also responsible for enforcing the rules within the community and governing ownership as well as income distribution, and this can be done through things like minimum wage or who owns what and how they own it. Additionally, the institutions govern where and how capital is acquired for development purposes. Next, we look at society and culture, and this mainly pertains to the business climate within the community, which in a very narrow sense is the relationship between the private and the public sector in terms of taxes and regulations and financial institutions. But let's look at this more in the specifics of community economic development. So the business climate is the community attitudes towards change and experimentation and innovation and communication. Basically, in a sense, how receptive is the community to community economic development? And as residents are going to prove our greatest asset in community economic development, well, we need them to be quite receptive. Next, we're going to look at markets, and this is both internal and external markets. And the external markets in this case are going to be a very important factor because they're the primary source of investment and sales. Additionally, we look at how the markets are all related to each other, how firms are related to each other inside the community, and the direction that the market influences in terms of goods and services. Basically, where are different markets pushing the goods within the community and the services within the community. We also consider gaps and disconnects. Gaps being basically any importing done in the community. What has to be brought in because it can't be made locally? Does this include services or leadership or just straight up consumer goods? Disconnects are firms producing the same thing but not communicating. In order to conduct successful community economic development, we all need to be on the same page. Finally, we're going to look at decision-making within the community, and this mainly pertains to the ability of a community to set forth a to-do list, what they want to accomplish through the process of development. And this involves distinguishing mainly between problems and symptoms, so we can target directly what is negatively impacting the community. Additionally, this relates to setting forth common values and priorities within the community, and this is all done through networking and social connections and social capital and such. Finally, we look at the attitude of the community. The overall attitude that is going to make it ideal for community economic development. So what is the best case scenario in this instance? Well, the best case scenario involves anger, such that there's motivation and determination to enact change, hope, such that people are willing to put forth an effort to enact change, and finally, a plan. So at this point, we've established a set of values within the community. We've established their goal, what they ultimately want to achieve through community economic development, and we've established their resources. We have all the initial conditions within the community. So now it's time to develop a plan, and this is step 2 of our 3-part approach to community economic development. And during this phase, we're going to choose from multiple approaches, multiple ways to conduct community economic development. The first thing we're going to focus on is community development versus community organizing. Community development is primarily the creation of physical infrastructure using locally available resources through local institutions or sometimes government-backed institutions. Organizing, in comparison, is how we get the voices of people heard, how we empower the people and enact social change and gain access to decision-making processes. Now, development and organizing are important in their combination in how they achieve power, how they work to give power to a community such that the community can conduct meaningful community economic development. Well, development is primarily used to keep power, and organizing is primarily used to gain power. So we need some combination of these two to actually enact community economic development, and this is going to depend on an analysis of what already exists within the community, which one we need to focus on. Now, for example, if we have a whole bunch of interest groups already within the community that are making their voices heard, we might need to do some development first. But if we have a lot of oppressed people, we need organizing first to actually fight the oppression. But once again, each approach is going to be specific to the community we're conducting development in. Now, here's one way to think about this whole development versus organizing debate. Let's just imagine the community is a boat. We have a boat, and I tell you that I want this boat to go forward. I want to make progress in the community, and I hand you one oar. And I tell you, go. Well, you're going to look at me kind of like, well, if I just row with this oar, I'm going to go in a circle. I'm not really going to go anywhere. But if I hand you 2 oars, if I hand you 2 oars, you have both development and organizing. Well, then you can conduct a meaningful development. You can make the boat go forward. Another way to think about this is the yin-yang symbol. We have some balance between the two, and this is because organizing ensures local participation but also local interest, but development ensures that we're actually carrying out projects. So if we combine these two, we have local projects being carried out by local people in local interest, which is how you conduct effective community economic development. Now, one good way to combine these two strategies is through a large community development corporation, one large CDC to actually carry out all the development projects, and this helps because we have money and power in that community development corporation that we can use to enact change. But at the same time, we use multiple small but localized interest groups to develop interests and priorities within the community, which they will then use the power and the resources of the large corporation to carry out. So we have small groups determining projects for the big guys to do. Next thing we want to think about is funding for the community development projects, and this is the most important thing in funding is diversity. We need diversity of funding and diverse portfolio, because if we have one large investor who puts forth 50% of the investment, well, all of a sudden they can direct what's going to happen within the community, and it's no longer in the best interest of the locals, it's now in the best interest of the investor. So we rely on things such as philanthropy and donations, and philanthropy depends on social networking and social capital within the community, but ultimately we want to use diversity of different funding to prevent one person from gaining too much power. The next thing we want to focus on is if we want to prioritize community or economic or development. Now, each of these 3 things has their different strategies and different benefits, but we'll combine them in some way ultimately. Community-based approaches, nonetheless, focus on reducing marginalization and exploitation in order to integrate economic and social change within a community. Economic-based approaches prioritize increasing jobs and income in the long run in order to make the community more suitable for external investment to attract investors, but also gain personal wealth. Development-based approaches focus on structural changes in order to increase local autonomy, and this is done through, well, diverse funding and shared ownership of different things, and ultimately we will see increase in local autonomy. But this, in the end, which of these three approaches we're going to focus on and prioritize depends on community values. That is correct. Once again, what is important to the community. So, for example, if the community really wants lots of high-paying jobs, well, we focus on economics. But if the community really wants the ability to make their own decisions, well, we'll focus on development. The next thing we're going to look at in the planning phase is how we're going to use the Community Development Corporation, the CDC, the go-to institution for our community economic development. Now, CDCs are primarily implementers of plans. They do the work of community economic development, and they're expected to work within the existing political system to conduct this meaningful development. Now, in order to do so, they need well-trained leadership, but also locally integrated leadership, people who know the strategies of community economic development well, but also know the local conditions well. They also need capital to conduct the actual growth and internal growth. And ultimately what they're going to try to do is act as market enhancers to make the community suitable for external investment, in which case after we have external investment, we will begin to see businesses grow within the community. We'll begin to see more jobs within the community. And this is primarily an economic-based approach here, but it's what the CDC stereotypically does in terms of economic development. And once we have increased external investment, we'll begin to see greater accumulation of personal wealth, which the Community Development Corporation will then begin to manage through directing capital. See, for example, they can say this amount of funding will be allotted towards housing projects, and this plot of land will be used for basically public gardens and stuff like that. Now, in order to be successful, CDCs need several things, and the first of which is autonomy. They need to be able to govern themselves and direct their own projects. They additionally need participation from the community to make sure that they stay integrated with local interest, well-trained leadership, and efficient use of resources. And once they have all these, then we'll begin to see some meaningful development. But there's also major disadvantages to the CDC model. The first of which is they often work with developers who are primarily interested in infrastructure creation for their own personal profits, not in actually benefiting the community. We also see large investors who are too eager to get their hands all over development projects, rapid urban decay that the CDC cannot keep up with, and simply lack of organizing that brings the CDC out of touch with community interests, such that they begin to conduct development that is not in the interest of the locals. The next thing to consider in developing a plan is the concept of ownership within the community, and the best model for ownership is always going to be the co-op and CED. Now, this has several benefits, the first of which is motivation for success. If individuals are all working together in a co-op model, then their individual success is grounded in the success of the firm as a whole, and for that reason they are highly prioritizing the success of the firm. Additionally, it transforms the stereotypical consumer and worker model such that the two are equal, and that the firm will then begin to operate in the best interest of the consumer, but also the best interest of the worker, such that it's an all-around win-win situation for people who are involved with the firm. Finally, it helps to increase individual wealth, because as we have individuals who are working with high motivation, but are also consumers and workers of the firm, we will begin to see meaningful progress in the development of that firm. Finally, we consider housing, the prototypical community economic development project, affordable housing. Now, affordable housing itself proposes a major contradiction, because we have this ideal of gaining common wealth for people, providing them with a house, because it's the American dream to have a roof over your head and have a house that just gains value every year, yee-haw. But at the same time, housing primarily ensures the wealth of private large investors. And this is because investors are willing to invest in housing because of the collateral, the guaranteed collateral, which is the house. See, if you invest in a house and the house fails, meaning that the person can no longer pay their rent, you can kick them out and you can say, all right, your house, someone else is going to come in and pay the rent. But if you invest in a business and the business fails, then there's nothing left. So investing in housing has some protection behind it. There's protection to the investor. Now, at the same time, housing produces an illusion, and this is the illusion of wealth accumulation. And here's why. See, individuals who are going to be receiving affordable housing are often not financially stable enough to have investments. They cannot buy large shares in a company. That's simply not within their budget. So they look to housing to guarantee their wealth accumulation. But the reality is that housing appreciates on average annually after inflation by 1%. That's the median value of appreciation. That means on average, 1% of people, well, that means on average, if you own a house, it goes up by value by 1% annually. That is a very small amount. That means 50% of homeowners are not even seeing 1% growth in their investment when owning a house. So it really does not increase your wealth that much. But now it's not even, let's take it one step further. Let's take it one step further. Let's think about the upkeep costs of keeping a house. Therefore, in owning a house, people are often losing money. The costs of keeping their house going are greater than the costs or than the benefits of owning the house itself, greater than the financial benefits of owning a house. So at this point in time, we'll look for a solution to this problem. How can we actually use housing to help people out? And the solution once again defaults back to the ownership model. We need some form of cooperative ownership, perhaps a community land trust in which the community grants land usage rights to people who own houses on the land, or a housing co-op in which the community owns the land and the house. And all of these models will again work to ensure the mutual benefit of the community, because once again, the consumer is also the worker. And this completes like the different strategies, the basic strategies we can use for community economic development at this point. So now we've established our starting point where we are in beginning community economic development, and we have a plan. And now it's time to get to it and just do it. And this takes us to our final stage of community economic development, which is implementing the actual plan we decided upon. And implementing the plan has to be done effectively, and this has a basis in several factors during the implementation process, the first of which is local knowledge. Essentially, the leaders behind the project have to be well integrated with the local conditions. They have to know what's important to the people in the community in order to make sure that the projects continue to uphold values that are important to different community members, and therefore conduct community economic development that will improve the community as the residents see most appropriate. The next factor leading to success is experienced leadership. Leaders need to be not only locally well-versed, but experienced in development. This requires extensive training because community economic development is a process that is essentially working within capitalism to kind of fight capitalism, so it's no easy task. And for that reason, much training is required to effectively conduct community economic development. The next part, and the most important part of implementing, is widespread involvement. See, community economic development needs to be a grassroots movement. The most important asset in conducting community economic development is the residents of the community itself. For that reason, everyone needs to be a part of this, and this can be achieved through door-to-door knocking strategies, having local meetings in like living rooms and such, continued evaluation and surveys of how the projects are going, and simply calling people through calling centers or just general calling to check up on the community, to make sure that people are involving themselves in the projects, helping to participate in actual construction of infrastructure and such, but at the same time that people are happy with the direction the community is taking and that the projects that are being accomplished are in the interest of the community. The final part of implementing a project is continued evaluation, realizing that at any point in time, the initial conditions established during the assessment can change, and for that reason, planners need to be ready to adjust the plan and strategy to account for changing conditions within the community. And for that reason, we add an arrow at the top of our graphic to show that at any point in time, we might need to go back to the assessment phase. And this concludes a general overview of community economic development, which is a three-step process characterized by assessment, planning, and implementing. Now, each community economic development strategy will be unique to a different community, and there will be unforeseen circumstances that are not accounted for in this graphic, but this does provide a general overview of basic community economic development.